Psalm 107 is aptly titled Reversal because it describes the way that God steps in and reverses a situation. There are specifically 4 vignettes in this psalm, 4 examples of situations where God steps in to rescue his people. The psalm is somewhat didactic. That means that it's instructive. It has an element of wisdom to it. It's a meditation on the various ways that Yahweh saves us. And remember, the theme of Book 5 is Hallelujah, Yahweh saves. And so this psalm will set that up and begin to give us some examples of that. We notice the very first verse is identical to the first verse of several other psalms. And we noted that it connects us to the previous book, Psalm 106, verse 1, connecting books 4 and 5 in that way, and also going forward to the second and third sections of book 5. All of them begin with the same verse, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever." Psalm 136 then will repeat this in every line to some extent. His love endures forever. The second couple verses here, 2 and 3, suggest that this psalm was composed after the exile, because it talks about God gathering from the lands, the east, the west, north, and south, and bringing the people back together. So it suggests this psalm being a post-exile. We have here the first of 4 situations in which people find themselves. The first is that of wandering in the wilderness, wandered in desert wastes, finding no city to dwell in, hungry, thirsty, their soul fainted within them. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way till they reached a city to dwell in. So they cried, their prayer is answered. And so here we have the chorus that we find in every one of these 4 sections of this psalm. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. For he satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul he fills with good things. And we see the reversal that's taking place here. Some wandered in desert wastes, but they reached a city to dwell in. So contrast desert wastes, loneliness, isolation to a community. And then contrast their hunger and thirst in verse 5 to the satisfaction that God provides in verse 9. Today, this psalm might be a prayer for refugees, for those who have been forced out of their homes by war, by famine, by political unrest, and they are wandering. And this is a wonderful promise that God will bring them into a city to dwell and satisfy their needs. The second vignette we have is that of foreign bondage. Some sat in darkness in the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons, for they had rebelled against the words of God. They had spurned the counsel of the Most High, so he bowed their hearts down with hard labor. They fell down with no one to help. This could be a reference to the exile. It could take them all the way back to Egypt, although they were not in Egypt because they had rebelled against the words of God. So more likely this is Babylon or any of the other exiles that the people had experienced. So they're in distress in prison. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and burst their bonds apart. The prayer is answered. So once again, give thanks. Verse 15, verse 16, he shatters the doors of bronze. He cuts into the bars of iron. The prayer is answered. And once again, we see this reversal. They sat in darkness and the shadow of death in verse 10. But verse 14, he brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death. They were in affliction and in iron, but he cut into the bars of iron, shattered the doors of bronze. He set the prisoner free. Now, for Israel, that certainly referred to their return from exile, coming out of Babylon, and earlier coming out of Egypt. For us today, we might think of the situation of those that are in prison, those that have rebelled and broken the law, and they find themselves in prison. The good news is God can provide even to the prisoner who has broken the law. He can provide redemption. He can set them free of the true bonds that are keeping them in shackles. So this is a prayer for prisoners, and I'm thankful for ministries like Prison Ministry Fellowship that are doing this, that are setting free those that are captive to sin in our prisons. Now, the third one would be disease or plague. Some were fools through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquity suffered affliction. They loathed any kind of food. They drew near the gates of death, so they lost their appetite. were near death because of their sickness. And notice the connection here between their iniquities and their affliction, that there are some types of disease, distress, sickness that are directly related to behavior. One example would be sexually transmitted diseases. Those are largely diseases that are shared through illicit sex. If two people have never been with another person sexually, they don't have to worry about sexually transmitted diseases. So this would be an example. This is something that Israel dealt with. This is stated even back in Exodus. There was the promise that if you followed the law, you would avoid the diseases that afflicted the pagan nations around them. So this is likely a reference to that. The many times that plagues broke out in Israel because of sexual sin. So there is a direct connection there. That's one example of that. But in this situation, they cried out to the Lord for help, and he delivered them from their distress. He sent out his word and healed them, delivered them from their destruction. So there's our give thanks, and this time it's a little longer. Let them also offer sacrifices of thanksgiving, tell of his deeds in songs of joy. So prayer answered, disease cured and healed. We go from suffering, affliction, to God's healing. The fourth vignette is the longest of the four. It describes the perils of those who go out on the sea, the life of a sailor. So this is the sailor's song, if you will. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. So that suggests the Mediterranean, the ocean. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. So it is a wonderful, amazing thing to be out in the ocean and to see and experience the power of the wind and the waves and the storms. And the sunrise, sunset, the stars, you can see the works of the Lord in the deep, see the great sea creatures, the whales, the dolphins. Well, he commanded and he raised a stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. God commands the storm. They mounted up to the heaven. They went down to the depths. So that's the ship lifting up and down on the waves. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. All their wisdom was swallowed up. They were at their wits' end. This is not the first time that we've seen this in the Scriptures. We can look at the story of Jonah and see how God commands the weather. We look in the Gospels and we see Jesus calming the storm on a couple occasions, and Paul shipwrecked. So God is clearly the God of the storm, the one that is in control of those things. And so in this case, it's not so much that the sailors have sinned; they just happen to be in this position where they are completely at the mercy of God to the storm. Well, sometimes that's the way it is with our lives as well. We don't do anything to deserve it, but there's a storm of life that comes our way. And so the text says that they cried to the Lord in their trouble, just as before, and he delivered them from their distress, and their prayer is answered. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad, the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks. Here's the chorus for his wonderful works. Let them extol in the congregation of the people and praise him in the assembly of the elders. So let's engage in public worship here, testify to what God has done. And here's the reversal. He commanded and raised the sea, and then he made the storm be still. The waves of the sea were hushed. Of course, this reminds us today not only of the sailors, of those who are out serving in the Navy and merchant ships around the world, but also the storms of life that slam us as well. It's good to be reminded that God commands the storm. He can command it to start. He can command it to stop. And we simply need to cry for help and put our trust in him and give thanks when he delivers us. The psalm then comes to a conclusion with some summary statements of reversal. I kind of pair these groups together here. Verse 33, he turns rivers into desert. And then the opposite of that, in verse 35, he turns a desert into pools of water. Likewise, he turns springs of water into thirsty ground, parched land into springs of water. So in both cases, those are reversals. And so that's what we see here. We see another one in verse 34, a fruitful land he turns into a salty waste. And then he turns it around, and there is land with a fruitful yield as well. Of course, in the land of Israel, you could look to the south and to the east. You could see the Dead Sea area that was literally a salty waste. And so the psalmist may have been referencing that actual geography. The second movement here, we see that kind of a summary statement that they were diminished, they were brought low, But guess what? The reversal is he raises up the needy out of affliction. And so there is wisdom in this psalm to be gained. So whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord. This is what I meant by the didactic element of this psalm, the teaching element. Learn from this situation, that whatever situation you're in, even if you put yourself in that situation, God is there to rescue you. This psalm also reminds us of a very significant New Testament prayer, the Magnificat of Mary, where she speaks of in similar terms of how God has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He's filled the hungry with good things, and the rich He sent away empty. How God reverses things. God turns things around. Psalm 30 is another great example of this. And it portrays for us what Jesus would ultimately bring when He comes preaching the kingdom, a reversal, a great reversal, an upside-down kingdom where the proud would be humbled and the humbled would be exalted. And this psalm then sets up for us the theme of Book 5. Hallelujah! Yahweh is a God who saves.